The final button on the gray wool felt like a period. At the end of a sentence she was condemned to read for the rest of her life. Dorothea stood still, her shoulders held in a posture of practiced stillness, while her mother, Beatrice, circled her like a dissatisfied general inspecting a new and disappointing recruit. The dress was, as always, impeccable in its construction and utterly soul-crushing in its effect. It was the color of a winter sky threatening rain, a color designed not to be seen. "A turn," Beatrice commanded, her voice thin and sharp as a needle. Dorothea turned the wool, brushing against her skin with a familiar, scratchy resignation. Her reflection in the long mirror was a study in nullity. A pale face, hair the color of unremarkable brown earth, pulled back so tightly it made her temples ache. And the dress. Always the dress. While her sisters, Clara and Isabel, were downstairs, shimmering in silks, the color of Jualza, amethyst, and sapphire, for the evenodds, gathering Dorothea was clad in fog. "Eight will do," Beatrice said, which was her highest form of praise where Dorothea was concerned. "Remember your place, Dorothea. You are there to assist. See that your sister's glasses are never empty. See that old Lady Carmody has her shawl. If a draft comes up, you are useful. Do not attempt to be decorative. I am useful. Do not attempt to be decorative." The words were an echo of her entire existence. At 26, Dorothea was the family's spinster, its unpaid housekeeper, its quiet, efficient engine. She managed the household accounts with a fierce secret pride, balancing the ledgers to the penny, stretching her father's dwindling income further than her mother or sisters could ever imagine. They saw the results of the food on the table, the polished silver butt. They never saw the hand that procured it. They saw a plain, gray daughter, who was thankfully no competition. Her mother's eyes narrowed, landing on a loose thread at Dorothea's cuff. She did not pluck it. Instead, she reached out and tucked it back into the seam with a sharp, punishing jab of her fingernail. It was a gesture that said, "Even your flaws must be hidden." The Duke of Ravenshaw is expected to make an appearance tonight," Beatrice said, her tone shifting, becoming suddenly animated. "Imagine, at our modest assembly. He has not been seen in society for years, not since the Duchess Pasta." She smoothed the front of her own gown, a deep, impressive burgundy. Clara has a new ribbon in her hair, the exact shade of a Ravenshaw rose. A thoughtful touch. "Do you not think?" Dorothea said nothing. The Duke of Ravenshaw was a figure of local legend, a man encased in grief and wealth. His estate, Blackmore Hall, sat on the northern cliffs, a vast, cold monolith that was said to be as silent and shuttered as its master. He was tragedy and title, the two most potent ingredients for a country Madeira's ambitions. Your father is waiting. Go down and see if the canops are arranged properly. The cook has a heavy hand with the parsley." Beatrice dismissed her with a wave, her attention already turning back to her own reflection, pinching her cheeks to bring a flush of color to them. Dorothea went, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished floorboards. She moved through her own home like a ghost, a habit learned from years of trying to take up as little space as possible. In the drawing room, her sisters were preening by the fire. Clara, the beauty, was laughing, a tinkling sound that was as practiced as her smile. Isabel the wit was holding court with the younger son of a baronet, her eyes sparkling with flirtatious victory. They were bright, burning stars. Dorothea was the quiet, empty space between them. She passed them without a word, her presence as noted as a change in the air pressure. In the dining room, she inspected the trays of food. The cook had indeed been overzealous with the parsley. With nimble, practiced fingers, Dorothea began picking off the offending green flecks, her mind elsewhere. She had seen the Duke of Ravenshaw once, years ago, before tragedy had taken him from the world. He had been at a county fair with his young, vibrant wife. He had not been smiling, even then. He had been watching. It was the thing she remembered most about him. While everyone else was looking at the prize-winning pig or the Morris dancers, he had been looking at the crowd, at the faces, his gaze dark and analytical. He had looked for a fraction of a second at her raw, gangly girl of 19 in a faded frock, and she had felt, not seen, but catalogued, filed away. The memory was so vivid that she did not hear the footsteps behind her until a voice, low and laced with a weariness that went bone deep, spoke her name. Dorothea, she startled, dropping a sprig of parsley. Her father, Mr. Bennet, stood in the doorway, his shoulders slumped inside his best coat. He was a man, fated by a louder, more demanding wife. You should not be doing that, he said, gesturing to the canops. We have staff for that. The staff is busy, father. And it is quicker to do it myself. She gave him a small, tired smile. It was the smile she reserved for him, a silent acknowledgement of their shared position in the household as ecosystem, necessary but overlooked. He sighed, a puff of air that smelled of brandy. Your mother has high hopes for tonight. A mother always has high hopes. The Duca, he began, then trailed off, shaking his head. He is a man burying himself alive. It is a fool's errand to try and dig him out. Dorothea finished her task and straightened, wiping her fingers on a small handkerchief from her pocket. Clara is wearing her new ribbons. Her father looked at her then, truly looked at her, and a flicker of something aguilt, perhaps, or a deep, helpless sorrow crossed his face. The gray is very, practical, my dear. Yes, Dorothea said, her voice perfectly even. That is the point of it. The assembly hall was a cacophony of sound and scented too much. Perfume, laughter pitched a shade too high, the squeak and scrape of the local musicians torturing a country dance. Dorothea found a small alcove behind a wilting potted fern and took up her station. From here, she had a perfect view of the room. She was the family sentry. She watched Clara, a vision in amethyst, being led onto the dance floor by a handsome officer. She watched Isabel hold a small court of admirers near the refreshments table. She watched her mother, a galleon in full sail, navigating the treacherous social waters, her eyes scanning the entrance. And then, the room changed. It was not a sudden silence, but a shift in the quality of the noise. The pitch of the chatter lowered, the frantic energy coalescing into a focused, unified hum of curiosity. A path cleared from the door, as if by an invisible force. Into that path stepped the Duke of Ravenshaw. He was taller than Dorothea remembered, and thinner. The years of grief had planed the flesh from his face, leaving behind a stark, handsome structure of bone and shadow. He was dressed in immaculate black, the only relief a stark white cravat. He was not a man. He was a statement, an elegy in motion. He moved with an economy of grace that spoke of absolute power, the kind of power that has no need to announce itself. His dark hair was untouched by gray, but his eyes looked ancient. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the worst and expected no better. He noticed the hush. He noticed the sudden, avid attention. He noticed the way every unmarried woman in the room, and every mother of an unmarried woman, seemed to hold her breath. His jaw tightened, a barely perceptible flicker of muscle. He was here because he had to be, not because he wanted to be. His gaze swept the room, dismissive and thorough. It passed over the hopeful, simpering faces, over the brightly colored silks and sparkling jewels. It passed over Clara's amethyst and Isabella's sapphire. It passed over Beatrice's triumphant, predatory smile. His eyes moved, cataloging, dismissing, until they found the alcove behind the wilting fern. And there, they stopped. For a long suspended moment, the Duke of Ravenshaw looked at Dorothea. He looked at the plain gray dress, the severe hair, the quiet stillness. He looked at her as if she were the only fixed point in a dizzying, chaotic universe. There was no warmth in his gaze, no flirtation, no invitation. It was a look of pure, unadulterated recognition, as if he had been searching for something, and had, against all odds, found it. Dorothea's breath caught in her throat. Her heart, a usually steady and reliable organ, gave a painful, traitorous lurch. She felt a flush creep up her neck, a hot tide of mortification and something else, something terrifyingly like hope. She wanted to look away, to retreat further into the shadows of the fern, but she could not. His gaze held her fast. He took a step, then another. He was moving, not toward the dance floor, not toward the refreshments, not toward the eager waiting host. He was walking directly toward her. The hum of the room intensified. 100 pairs of eyes followed his trajectory, their gazes like tiny, stinging arrows, landing on Dorothea's gray-clad back. She was no longer invisible. She was the target. Her mother's face was a mask of disbelief, slowly hardening into fury. Clara had stopped mid-laugh, her pretty mouth agape. Isabella's witty retort died on her lips. Dorothea felt a wave of panic. She was not equipped for this. She had no witty banter, no practiced smiles. Her only defense was the gray wool, and it had just failed her spectacularly. He stopped before her, so close she could see the fine lines etched around his eyes, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hand as it rested on his waistcoat. He was real. He was not a legend, but a man, and he was looking at her as if she held the answer to a question he had not yet asked. Miss Bennet," he said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of any social pleasantry. It was the sound of a key, turning in a lock that had not been opened for a very long time. Your Grace," she managed, her own voice a thin, reedy whisper. She was acutely aware of the potted fern, of her own ridiculous position as a wallflower in hiding. He did not smile. He simply continued to look at her, his gaze so intense it felt as if it were stripping away the gray dress, the years of practiced invisibility, and seeing the terrified, competent, lonely woman beneath. "I find myself in need of a wife," the Duke of Ravenshaw said, his voice dropping even lower. Though the entire room strained to hear, "Of the trustees of my late wife's estate have a concerns. They meet in 1 month. I require a duchess before then. A respectable, sensible woman who understands duty." His eyes held hers. "You will do." It was not a proposal, it was a declaration of fact, like stating the sky was blue or that winter was coming. Dorothea stared at him, her mind a maelstrom of shock and disbelief. This could not be happening. This was a dream, a feverish, impossible fantasy, cooked up by a lonely spinster hiding behind a plant. He had bypassed every titled lady, every celebrated beauty, every ambitious Mazaris daughter, and walked across a crowded room to make a business proposition to the gray mouse in the corner. Around them, the silence was absolute. The musicians had stopped playing. The only sound was the frantic panic thumping of Dorothea's own heart. Her mother was moving toward them, her face a thundercloud. Dorothea had seconds, perhaps less, before her life was no longer her own to decide. She looked into the Duca's eyes, into the cold, desolate landscape of his grief, and saw a flicker of something she recognized: desperation. He was not a prince offering a glass slipper. He was a drowning man, grasping for a piece of driftwood. And she, for reasons she could not fathom, was that driftwood. All her life, she had been told she was useful. Her mother had trained her for it, honed her into a perfect instrument of quiet competence. And now, the most powerful man in the county was looking at her with that same stark assessment. "You will do." The words should have been insulting. They should have stung. But coming from him in that moment, they felt like the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. He was not offering a fairy tale. He was offering a transaction. And Dorothea, who had spent her life balancing ledgers, understood transactions. She took a breath, the first steady one since he had started walking toward her. She met his gaze, and for the first time in her life, she did not look away. "Before I answer," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the silence of the room, "You will come to my father's house tomorrow, and you will tell me the truth." all of it. I do not bargain with half a story. Your grace a flicker of something, a surprise, respect, crossed his face. He gave a single, sharp nod. Ah, had. At 10, Ada, and then he turned and walked away, leaving Dorothea Bennet standing in the wreckage of her own invisibility, the focus of every eye in the room. Her mother's furious face, the first of the many storms she knew she would now have to weather. The night had been a blur of recriminations. Her mother's fury had been a physical force in their small house, a storm that rattled the windows and made the air thick with unspoken rage. Clara had wept with the injustice of it all, while Isabel had sharpened her tongue on Dorothea's unbelievable audacity. Her father had retreated to his study with a bottle of brandy and had not emerged. The crime was not that Dorothea had been chosen. The crime was that she had been chosen first. Now, in the cold light of morning, the house was silent, holding its breath. Dorothea sat in the parlor, the same gray dress on her back. It felt different today. Yesterday it had been armor. Today it felt like a lie. She had not slept. Instead, she had sat at the small desk in her room, the household ledgers open before her, the neat columns of figures, a familiar comfort in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. She heard the crunch of gravel on the drive precisely at 10 o'clock. Not a minute before, not a minute after. Of course. Her mother and sisters had made themselves conspicuously absent, retreating to their rooms under the pretense of headaches, their curiosity warring with their outrage. Only her father was with her, sitting stiffly in his chair, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. The Duke of Ravenshaw was shown in. In the daylight, he seemed even starker, a figure carved from granite and winter. He filled their modest parlor, his presence shrinking the furniture, making the faded chintz look pathetic. He gave a curt nod to her father, but his eyes were on Dorothea. "A Mr. Bennet," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I would speak with your daughter alone." Her father looked at her, a question in his eyes. Dorothea gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He hesitated, then rose and quit the room, closing the door softly behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place was unnervingly final. They were alone. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The Duke did not sit. He stood by the window, looking out at their small, struggling garden. You asked for the truth," he said, not turning around. It is not a pleasant story. The truth rarely is," Dorothea replied, her hands clasped in her lap to still their shaking. He turned then, and the look on his face was stripped of all ducal authority. It was the face of a man utterly weary, utterly lost. My son, Arthur, is 7 years old. Since she died 2 years ago, he has not spoken a word." The blunt confession hung in the air between them. Dorothea's heart ached. A silent, grieving child. The doctors say it is a malady of the will. The governesses have had 6 essais. He is stubborn. They are wrong. He is a trapped. In silence, the Duke's hands clenched into fists at his sides. My late wife's family, the Ellsworths, never approved of me. They believe I am cold, unfit. Her father, the Earl, is the head of the trust that manages Arthur's inheritance from his mother. It is a considerable fortune. The Earl has petitioned the trustees. He claims my son is languishing, that my household is one of morbid grief, and that he should be granted guardianship. He wants to take your son," Dorothea said softly. He wants to control the Ellsworth fortune," the Duke corrected, his voice laced with cold fury. But yes, he will take my son." The trustees are old men. They are swayed by appearances. They see a grieving widower in a silent house and a silent child, and they see instability. They have given me an ultimatum: show them a stable, thriving home. A new duchess. A mother for my son. They meet in 1 month. If I have not remarried by then, they will grant the Earl's petition. Here, it was the whole, unvarnished, ugly truth. It was not about love, or even companionship. It was about custody, about money, about saving a child from the clutches of grasping relatives. It was a ledger, after all, a problem to be solved. He looked at her, his gaze raw. "I have been watching you for 2 years, Miss Bennet." The words sent a shock through her. 2 years? Ah, at the market. I saw you argue with a vendor over a halfpenny, and then give the apple you won to a beggar child. At the church fete, I saw you sit with the old woman everyone else ignores, listening to the same story she tells every year. I have seen you manage your family as decline with a quiet dignity they do not deserve. You do not flinch from duty. You do not indulge in hysterics. You are our constant. He took a step closer. Ah, I do not need a decorative duchess, Miss Bennet. I do not need a wit or a beauty. I need a woman who will not break. I need a woman who will stay. A woman who will stay. He thought she was strong. He had looked at her gray, silent life and mistaken resignation for resilience. She stood up, her legs feeling surprisingly steady. She walked to the small desk in the corner, where she kept her household accounts. She picked up a pen, the familiar weight a comfort in her hand. I have conditions, she said, turning to face him. His eyebrows, which had been drawn together in a line of bleak misery, rose a fraction of an inch. Conditions? You are offering me a title and a position, but I would be your wife and the mistress of your house. I will not be a figurehead. I will not be a guest who is ignored until needed. She took a breath. First, I will have full authority over the household. The staff, the menus, the accounts, all of it. They will answer to me. He nodded. Done. A second, the nursery. If I am to be a mother to your son, then I will be his mother. No governesses, no tutors, no doctors will be hired or dismissed without my consent. His care will be my domain. Entirely agreed. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. A third. And this is the most important. We will not erase your late wife. Her portrait will remain. Her favorite rooms will not be shut up. Her memory will be honored. Your son has already lost his mother. He will not be forced to lose the memory of her as well. I will not be a replacement. I will be an addition. A profound stillness settled over him. He looked at her, and for the first time, the bleakness in his eyes was tempered by something else. A light, very faint, but it was there. He had expected her to ask for jewels, for an allowance, for a new wardrobe. He had not expected this. Her name was Eleanor, he said, his voice rough with emotion. He had clearly not let himself feel for a very long time. She loved roses. And she sang a particular hymn when a storm was coming, to keep Arthur from being frightened. Dorothea's throat tightened. "Then we shall plant roses. And you will teach me the hymn." He was silent for a long time, just looking at her. He was seeing her. Dorothea Bennet, not the grey mouse, not the useful spinster. Her is that all? He asked, his voice softer now. No, she said. There is one more thing. My family, my mother will expect a compensation, a comfortable allowance, my father's debts paid, my sister's dowries secured. They are not kind people, your grace, but they are my blood. The price of my freedom is their security. This, he had expected. He gave a curt nod. I will have my solicitor, Mr. Vane, draw up the papers. Good. Dorothea said. She put the pen down. The bargain was struck. She had just sold herself, but she had negotiated the terms. And in doing so, she had saved a small piece of her soul. "I will be a good wife to you, your grace," she said, her voice formal once more. "I will be a good mother to your son. You have my word, Alexander," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. My name is Alexander," he said. "If you are to be my wife, you should use it." It was, she realized, the first crack in the granite, the first sign that the man was still there, inside the Duke. Alexander, she repeated softly. The name felt foreign on her tongue. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the ledger from her hands. His fingers brushed hers. A jolt, sharp and unexpected, went through her. He looked down at the book, at her neat, precise columns of numbers. What is this?" he asked. My father's household accounts," she said. "I have managed them for 10 years." He looked from the ledger back to her face. A slow, thoughtful expression dawned. "I see," he said, and she had the distinct feeling that he did. The journey north was a blur of gray skies and rattling carriage wheels. Dorothea had left her home with a single trunk and no fanfare. Her mother had accepted the Duca's generous settlement with a grim satisfaction, her anger at being upstaged warring with her delight at being solvent. Her sisters had looked at her with a new, unwelcome mixture of envy and pity. She had not been kissed goodbye, she had been discharged. Alexander had been a silent companion for most of the journey, wrapped in a cloak of thought as dark as his coat. They spoke only of practicalities, the route, the weather, the estimated time of their arrival. It was not the journey of a bride and groom, but of two generals planning a difficult campaign. As the landscape grew wilder, the hills turning to rugged, wind-swept moors, a sense of foreboding settled in Dorothea's stomach. They were leaving the gentle, rolling country of her home behind, entering a harsher, more primal world. This was his land. Blackmore Hall appeared suddenly, a silhouette against a bruised purple sky. It was not a house, it was a fortress, a jagged collection of stone towers and crenellated walls perched on a cliff's edge, with the churning gray sea as its moat. It looked as if it had been carved from the cliff itself by a giantess hand. There were no welcoming lights, no plumes of smoke from the chimneys. The house was dark. "It was waiting. It is a formidable," Dorothea said, her first unsolicited comment in hours. Alexander looked at it, not with pride, but with a kind of weary resignation. "It is cold," he said. Eleanor tried to warm it. She planted the gardens, she hung tapestries. But the stone has a memory. It remembers the cold. The carriage clattered into a vast, empty courtyard. A single groom appeared to take the horses. The great oak doors swung open, and a man stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was tall and thin, with a stoop that suggested years spent bent over books or ledgers. "The housekeeper," Dorothea presumed. "Your Grace," the man said, his voice dry as dust. "A welcome home. We were not expecting you until tomorrow." Other roads were clear. "Pool," Alexander said, stepping down and turning to help Dorothea. His hand was warm and firm on hers as he guided her to the ground. This is the Duchess." "My wife, the housekeeper." Pool did not bow. He gave a slight, skeletal inclination of his head, his eyes, small and dark, flicking over Dorothea's gray dress with an expression that was not quite a sneer, but was certainly not a welcome. Your Grace," he said to her, the title sounding like an accusation. They stepped inside. The great hall was a cavern of shadows and cold air. A fire had been laid in the massive stone fireplace, but it had not been lit. Tapestries depicting grim-faced ancestors hung on the walls, their woven eyes seeming to follow her. The air smelled of damp stone and disuse. Her father-in-law had said the Duke was burying himself alive. He had not been exaggerating. This was his tomb. "Where is my son?" Alexander asked, his voice echoing in the vast space. In the nursery, Your Grace." "Ah," Poole said. He has not left it all day." "I will go to him," Alexander said, already turning toward the grand sweeping staircase that rose into the darkness. He stopped, turning back to Dorothea. For a moment, he looked as lost as she felt. "Poole will show you to your rooms. We will dine in 1 hour, Anne," and then he was gone, his footsteps echoing as he ascended into the gloom, leaving her alone with the skeletal housekeeper and the watchful ghost of his ancestors. "This way, Your Grace," Poole said, his voice laced with a subtle insolence. He clearly did not approve. She was the 7th governess, in a way, just with a better title. He led her not up the grand staircase, but down a long, cold corridor. The rooms he showed her were magnificent, a suite of chambers with towering windows that looked out over the churning sea. The furniture was draped in dust cloths, the air thick with the scent of what had been the Duchess's rooms. Poole announced, they have been untouched, they were Eleanor's rooms. Of course. Alexander, in his grief, had not thought. Poole, in his malice, had been deliberate. He was testing her. Dorothea walked into the center of the main chamber and ran a hand over a dust-covered table. They are beautiful, she said, her voice calm and even. But they are not mine. I will take the guest suite in the east wing. The one nearest the nursery. Apolli's thin lips tightened. He had expected an outburst, a demand, perhaps even tears. He had not expected quiet, practical authority. Ere you wish, your grace, and Poole, she said, turning to face him. Have the fire in the great hall lit, and open the curtains, all of them. This house has been dark for too long. She had won the first skirmish, but the war, she knew, had just begun. Her new rooms were smaller, but they were clean and aired. She changed from her gray traveling dress into another, identical one. She had a trunk full of them, her Mother Ross parting gift. A reminder of who she was, or who she was supposed to be. She found her way to the nursery herself. The door was slightly ajar. She stood outside for a long moment, listening. There was no sound, no childish chatter, no laughter, no crying, just a profound, unnatural silence. The room was large, with a fine rocking horse, and shelves of toys that looked as if they had never been played with. Alexander stood by the window, his back to her. In a small chair, by the unlit fire, sat a small boy. He was a miniature of his father, with the same dark hair and serious brow. He was dressed in a perfect little sailor's suit. In his lap, he clutched a small worn wooden bird, his knuckles white. He was not looking at his father. He was not looking at the toys. He was staring into the empty fireplace. His expression, one of intense, focused concentration, as if he were trying to will a fire into existence through sheer force of will. He did not look up when Dorothea entered. He gave no sign that he was even aware of her presence. Arthur, Alexander said, his voice gentle. This is Dorothea. She has come to live with us. The boy did not move. He did not blink. The silence in the room deepened, becoming a living, breathing thing. It was the childish shield, his sword, his fortress. Dorothea did not approach him. She did not kneel down and try to coax a word from him. She remembered what it felt like to be small and silent in a world of loud, demanding adults. Instead, she walked to the windows. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, shutting out the last of the day's light. It is dark in here, she said to no one in particular. And with a strength that surprised even herself, she grabbed the heavy cord and pulled. The curtains swept open, with a groan of protest. Pale evening light flooded the room, chasing the shadows into the corners. For the first time, Dorothea could see the color of the walls a cheerful yellow, now faded. She could see the dust motes dancing in the air. Alexander flinched, as if the light were a physical blow. The boy, Arthur, did not flinch. But for the briefest of moments his eyes flickered from the fireplace to the newly illuminated window. It was a tiny movement, almost imperceptible, but Dorothea saw it. It was a start. Dinner was a silent, miserable affair. They ate in a cavernous dining hall, at a table that could have seated 40. The fire pool had been instructed to light sputtered weakly in the grate, doing little to warm the vast cold space. The food was bland and overcooked. Poole served them himself, his movements slow and deliberate, his presence a constant, silent judgment. Alexander ate little, his mind clearly elsewhere. Dorothea, determined to show no weakness, ate everything on her plate, the tasteless food, a metaphor for her new life, something to be endured, not enjoyed. After dinner, Alexander retreated to his study, a room Dorothea had not yet been invited to enter. She was left alone in the great hall. The fire, now a pile of glowing embers. The ancestors on the tapestries seemed to watch her with their cold, woven eyes. She was the Duchess of Ravenshaw, and she had never felt more alone in her life. She did not go to bed. Instead, she found her way to the kitchens. They were as cold and silent as the rest of the house. A single sleepy kitchen maid was scrubbing a pot. The girl looked up, her eyes wide with fear, when Dorothea entered. "Your Grace," she stammered, dropping into a clumsy curtsy. What is your name?" Dorothea asked, her voice gentle. "A Mary, Your Grace." "A Mary," Dorothea said, giving her a small smile. "Tomorrow, I would like you to bake a seed cake. A very plain one, and we will need to air the entire house. Every window, every door. Can you see to it?" The girl stared at her dumbfounded. Air the house. Your Grace?" Yes," Dorothea said. It smells of sadness. We are going to let it out." She left the kitchens and went to the room she knew would be the heart of her campaign, the estate office. It was as she expected, unlocked. Inside, a single lamp burned low. It was a purely functional space, dominated by a large desk and shelves filled with leather-bound ledgers, Alexander's ledgers. She ran her hand over the spines, a thrill of something like homecoming running through her. This, she understood. This was a language she spoke fluently. She pulled one down. The estate accounts, 1834. She opened it. The handwriting was meticulous, precise. Pulias, she suspected. She sat down at the desk, pulled the lamp closer, and began to read. She would learn this house, this estate, from the inside out. She would learn its strengths, its weaknesses, its secrets. She was a woman who had been trained to be useful, and she was about to make herself indispensable. The days at Blackmore Hall settled into a routine, a quiet battle of wills, waged in corridors and silent rooms. Dorothea's campaign to bring life back to the house began in earnest. Every morning, she insisted the curtains be thrown open, the windows unlatched to let in the sea air, however cold. The staff, accustomed to the gloom, moved with a resentful slowness at first, but Dorothea was relentless. She was polite. Her voice never rose, but her presence was a constant, gentle pressure. She did not command. She participated. She worked alongside Mary in the kitchens, her hands dusted with flour as she demonstrated how to make a lighter pastry. She went with the gardeners into the overgrown rose garden. Her gray dress soon smudged with dirt as she helped them clear the weeds from around the thorny, neglected bushes Eleanor had planted. She learned the names of every servant, their duties, their small private worries. The staff, led by the perpetually disapproving Poole, watched her with suspicion. She was not like any duchess they had ever imagined. She did not demand. She did. Her greatest challenge and her most important work was Arthur. She did not force herself upon him. She did not try to bribe him with sweets or toys. She simply was. Every morning, she would go to the nursery and sit by the window, a book of accounts or a piece of mending in her lap. She did not speak to him, not directly. She would murmur to herself about the weather or comment on the flight of a seagull outside the window. Arthur remained in his small chair by the fireplace, clutching his wooden bird, a silent, unmoving sentinel. But she noticed the small things. The way his head would be angled slightly toward her when she spoke, the way his eyes would follow her when she moved about the room. He was listening, he was watching. Alexander remained a distant, shadowy figure. He would join her for their silent, strained dinners, his eyes dark with a weariness that seemed to seep into his bones. He saw the changes in the house, the open windows, the scent of baking from the kitchens, the flicker of life returning to the cold stona, but he said nothing. He watched her as he watched everything. From a distance, his expression unreadable. One evening, as she sat alone in the great hall, trying to read, by the light of the now roaring fire, he appeared in the doorway of his study. The accounts," he said, his voice startling her. You have been in my office." It was not an accusation, but a statement of fact. Yes," she said. not looking up from her book. Household books were a disaster. The butcher has been overcharging you for 3 years. He walked into the room and stood before the fire, blocking its warmth. A pool has managed the books for 20 years. A pool is either incompetent or complicit, Dorothea said, calmly, turning a page. I would be grateful if you would look it over when you have a moment. He was silent for a long moment. She could feel his gaze on her, heavy and intense. The Earl of Ellsworth arrives in 2 weeks. With the trustees. I am aware of the date, she said. He took a step closer. He will try to paint you as an interloper, an opportunist. He will say, you have no affection for the boy, let him, Dorothea said, finally looking up at him. The firelight flickered across his face, making the shadows in his eyes seem deeper. Affection is not a performance, Your Grace. It is built in quiet moments. It cannot be summoned for an audience. His gaze softened almost imperceptibly. I had not expected this, he said, gesturing vaguely at the room, at the warm fire, at her. I had expected a bargain. A transaction. It is still a transaction, she said, her voice quiet. Am holding up my end. I expect you to hold up yours. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was a sad, fleeting thing, but it was there. Of course, Your Grace, he said, and for the first time, the title did not sound like a formality. It sounded like a name he was learning to like. The next afternoon, a storm rolled in from the sea, battering the cliffs with wind and rain. The sky turned a bruised, violent purple, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was a constant, angry roar. Dorothea was in the nursery, sewing a tear in one of Arthura's shirts, when the first clap of thunder shook the house. She looked over at Arthur. He had not moved from his chair, but his small body was rigid. His knuckles were white where he gripped the wooden bird. He was terrified. This was it. The hymn. Dorothea put down her sewing. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She did not know the words, only the purpose. She began to hum a low, simple tune that she pulled from some half-forgotten childhood memory. It was not Eleanor's hymn, but it was a song. She hummed as she walked over to the toy shelf. She hummed as she took down a box of wooden soldiers. She set them up on the floor, humming all the while, creating a small, orderly world in the midst of the storm's chaos. Another clap of thunder, louder this time, rattled the windows. Arthur flinched, a small, violent jerk of his body. Dorothea did not look at him. She kept humming, moving the soldiers, her movements calm and deliberate. She was an island of peace in his sea of fear. From the corner of her eye, she saw him move. He slid off his chair, his wooden bird still clutched in his hand. He crept, slowly, cautiously, toward her. He sat on the floor a few feet away, his knees drawn up to his chin, and watched her. The storm raged outside. Inside the nursery, there was only the sound of Dorothea's quiet, steady humming, and the gentle click of the wooden soldiers. After a long while, she felt a small weight against her arm. She looked down. Arthur had leaned against her, his head resting on her shoulder. His eyes were closed. He was not asleep, but he was, for the first time since she had arrived, at rest. She stopped humming. The silence that followed was different. It was not empty. It was full of a fragile, nascent trust. She did not know how long they sat there. When the door opened, she looked up to see Alexander standing there. He had clearly come to check on his son, his face a mask of parental anxiety. He stopped dead when he saw them, his gaze taking in the scene on the floor, his silent son, leaning against his new wife, the storm forgotten, his face crumpled. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing to witness. The granite cracked, the Duke disappeared, and for a moment it was just Alexander, a man overwhelmed by a hope he had long since abandoned. He said nothing. He simply backed out of the room and closed the door, leaving them to their quiet peace. That night, for the first time, he knocked on the door of her room. She was brushing her hair, her reflection a surprise in the mirror. There was a touch of color in her cheeks, a softness around her eyes that had not been there before. Come in," she said. He entered, holding a small leather-bound book. "I thought you might need this," he said, holding it out to her. She took it. It was a book of hymns. A single ribbon marked a page. The sailors. Hope, It was her favorite, he said, his voice low. For storms. Thank you, she said, her fingers closing around the book. I will learn it. He nodded, his gaze lingering on her. Leaned on you. No one has touched him in 2 years, he said. A note of wonder in his voice. Not even me. He is not a fortress to be stormed, Alexander, she said softly. He is a locked room. You must find the key. Or, if you cannot find it, you must sit outside the door and wait. And sing. He looked at her, his eyes full of 1,000 unspoken things. Gratitude, guilt, a dawning, terrifying affection. I do not know how to sing. Then you must learn, she said. We both must. The arrival of the Earl of Ellsworth and the trustees was preceded by a flurry of activity. Poole, under Dorothea's direct and unblinking supervision, oversaw the airing of the grandest guest suites. The finest silver was polished, the best linens were brought out from storage. Dorothea was preparing her battlefield. The Earl was a man who wore his importance like a heavy coat, even in summer. He was large and florid, with a booming voice and eyes that missed nothing. He greeted Alexander with a chilly formality, and Dorothea with a look of undisguised contempt, his gaze sweeping over her still gray dress as if it were a personal insult. The 2 trustees were older, drier men, who looked at Blackmore Hall with the critical eyes of bankers, assessing a risky investment. They were Mr. Farthing and Sir Clive Benton, and their faces were maps of caution. Their first glimpse of the house must have been a surprise. The great hall was filled with light, a massive bowl of wildflowers, gathered by Dorothea and Mary that morning, sat on the central table, their scent warring with the old stone. A fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth. It was not the tomb the Earl had likely described. The Earl's first move was to demand to see his grandson. Alexander led the party to the nursery. Dorothea followed a pace behind, a silent gray shadow. They found Arthur sitting in his usual chair. The Earl strode toward him, his arms outstretched. "Arthur, my boy, it is your grandfather." He stared at the man, his face a small blank mask. He clutched his wooden bird so tightly his knuckles were bloodless. The Earl said, turning to the trustees, his voice a performance of sorrow. "The boy is lost. He does not even recognize his own blood. This hausa, this griefa, it has stolen his voice." Dorothea stepped forward. She did not look at the Earl. She spoke to Arthur, her voice calm and low. "Arthur, your grandfather, and these gentlemen have come a long way. We are going to have seed cake in the garden. Would you like to show them the way to the new rose bushes?" She held out her hand. For a heart-stopping moment, Arthur did not move. The Earl watched, a smug, triumphant smile playing on his lips. The trustees exchanged a grave look. Alexander held his breath. Then, slowly, deliberately, Arthur slid from his chair. He walked past his grandfather's outstretched arms. He walked past the trustees. He walked to Dorothea, and he placed his small, cold hand in hers. It was a declaration, a choice. The Heirless face turned a dangerous shade of purple. The seed cake in the garden was a masterstroke of strategy. The rose bushes, while still small, were showing new green shoots. The scene was one of domestic tranquility. The Earl tried to engage his grandson in conversation. His booming questions met with the boy's implacable silence. Dorothea, meanwhile, spoke quietly with Sir Clive about the different varieties of tea, her knowledge surprising him. Alexander found himself in a surprisingly deep conversation with Mr. Farthing about crop rotation. a topic he had not thought about in years but found. To his surprise, he had opinions on. Opinions Dorothea had quietly unearthed while organizing the estate papers. The Earl was being outmaneuvered, and he knew it. He was a creature of shadows and whispers, and Dorothea had dragged him into the light. That evening, as Dorothea was going over the next day's menus with a nervous but proud Mary, a message came. The Duca's solicitor had arrived. Mr. Vane. She remembered the name. He was the one who had drawn up the papers for her family's settlement. She went to the study, a room she now entered without knocking. Alexander was there, with a man who rose as she entered. Mr. Crispin Vane was the opposite of the Earl. He was charming, handsome in a polished, urbane way, with a ready smile and intelligent eyes. He was the picture of a trusted family advisor. "Aha, Duchess," he said, his smile warm and genuine. It is a pleasure to finally meet you. I have heard remarkable things." He bowed over her hand. Alexander has told me of the miracles you have worked here." Dorothea felt a prickle of unease. His flattery was too smooth, his charm too practiced. She had spent her life among people who used words as weapons or masks. She was an expert in their detection. Mr. Vane," she said, withdrawing her hand, "I've done nothing more than open the windows." Aptly put," he said with a laugh, his eyes crinkling. Sometimes that is all a house needs. Or a man, He clapped Alexander on the shoulder. Alexander, to Dorothea's surprise, smiled a real, unguarded smile. They were friends. Old friends. Crispin is more than my solicitor," Alexander said. Is the man I trust most in this world. He will represent our interests before the trustees tomorrow." "Indeed," Crispin said, his expression turning serious. The Earl is a formidable opponent. He will not fight fair." "But do not worry, Your Grace," he said to Dorothea. We are prepared." The prickle of unease intensified. He was too confident, too reassuring. Later that night, unable to sleep, Dorothea returned to the estate office. Something about Mr. Van A's smile had snagged in her memory. Something was wrong. She sat at the desk, the new ledger she had created open before her. She had reconciled the household accounts, but the larger estate books were still a tangled mess. Pulias, meticulous but opaque entries. She pulled down the ledger for the current year. She had been so focused on household expenses that she had only given the estate outgoings a cursory glance. Now she looked again. There were regular payments, large ones made out to a company she did not recognize, a Northern Timber and Supply. The payments were authorized by Poole, but countersigned. She squinted at the second signature, C. Vane. Of course, the solicitor would be involved in large estate transactions. It was not unusual, but the frequency, the size of the payments, it seemed excessive for an estate that was not expanding, not building. She pulled down the previous year's ledger, and the year before that, the payments to Northern Timber and Supply had begun shortly after Eleanora's death. They had increased steadily over the past 2 years. She went to the correspondence files. She found the letters from Northern Timber and Supply. The invoices were vague for a materia and a surveying. The letterhead gave an address in York. On a hunch, she found the file containing the solicitor's own correspondence. His address. It was not the same, but it was in the same district of York, a small, respectable street of offices. It could be a coincidence. It was not a coincidence. She sat back, her mind racing. Vane and Poole. For 2 years, they had been bleeding the estate dry, siphoning off funds through a false company. Alexander, lost in his grief, had signed whatever was put in front of him. He trusted Crispin Vane implicitly. He had said so himself. "He is the man I trust most in this world." And this man, this trusted friend, was about to represent him in the most important battle of his life. A battle against the Earl, who wanted to take his son. Why? Why would Vane, who was already robbing him? Unless the Earl was not the true enemy. What if the Earl's petition was not the threat, but the distraction? If the Earl won custody, Arthur and his vast Ellsworth inheritance would move out of Blackmore. The trustees' attention would be on the transition. Who would be paying attention to the Ravenshaw estate accounts then? Vane would be free to plunder what was left. Or, worse, what if Vane was working with the Earl? What if he had been the one to encourage the Earl, feeding him information about the silent child, the grieving Duke, the cold house? What if he was playing both sides against each other, for his own profit? The thought was so monstrous, so chilling, that Dorothea felt physically sick. She looked at the ledgers, at the neat columns of figures that told a story of profound betrayal. This was her proof. But it was not enough. It was her word, the word of the upstart grey-clad Duchess, against the word of the Duca's oldest friend. Alexander would not believe her, not without something more. The hearing was set for 10 o'clock the next morning in the library. She had less than 12 hours to save her husband from his best friend, and a son from them both. She worked through the night, the lamp burning low, her mind sharp and clear. She did not look for more proof of the fraud. She had enough to plant the seed of doubt. What she needed was a weapon. She went back through the ledgers, page by page, year by year, her nimble fingers tracing the columns of numbers. She was not just an accountant, she was a hunter, and she was tracking her prey. It was just before dawn when she found it. A single entry from 3 years ago before Eleanor's death. A payment to a solicitor in London. It was a small one-time fee for the drawing up of a document, a codicil to the late Duchess's will. Dorothea had seen the will. Vane had provided a copy, but there had been no mention of a codicil. She remembered something Alexander had said on the journey north, a bitter, throwaway comment, that Eleanor's father had never trusted him, that he had tied up her fortune so tightly Alexander couldn't touch it, only Arthur. What if Eleanor had not trusted her father? What if, seeing his grasping nature, she had taken steps to protect her son, not from her husband, but from her own family? What if she had added a codicil, a secret amendment to her will, one that Vane had conveniently elasta, or suppressed after her death, a codicil that might change everything? Dorothea closed the ledger. She knew what she had to do. She had the truth. Now, she just had to make them believe it. The library at Blackmore Hall was a room built for intimidation. Dark wood shelves soared to a vaulted ceiling, filled with thousands of books that had not been read in a generation. The long table was polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the grim faces of the men gathered around it. At one end sat the Earl of Ellsworth, flanked by his own solicitor, a man who looked like a well-fed vulture. On one side sat the trustees, Farthing and Benton, their faces impartial, but etched with the gravity of their task. On the other side sat Alexander, and beside him, looking calm, confident, and utterly trustworthy, was Crispin Vane. Dorothea entered last, taking a seat slightly behind her husband. She wore her usual grey dress, but she carried a small, leather-bound ledger. Vane glanced at it, a flicker of annoyance crossing his handsome face before being replaced by his charming smile. The Earl began, his voice booming with manufactured sorrow. He painted a picture of a neglected child, lost in a house of morbid grief, his spirit being crushed by a cold and distant father. He spoke of his daughter, the sainted Eleanor, and how her heart would break to see her son so abandoned. It was a masterful performance. Then he turned his attention to Dorothea. "And now," he boomed, gesturing toward her. This a woman, a person of no background, no standing, plucked from obscurity a month ago. What does she know of raising a future marquess? What does she know of a mother's love? She is an opportunist, a caretaker, hired to play a role for which she is woefully unsuited. Alexander started to rise, his face a mask of cold fury. "You will not speak of my wife that way." Dorothea placed a hand on his arm. "It is all right, Alexander," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the tense silence. He looked at her, surprised. She gave him a small, reassuring nod, and he sat back down, though his jaw remained clenched. The Earl asks what I know, Dorothea said, addressing the trustees. He is right. I am not a titled lady. I was not raised to be a duchess. I was raised to be useful. She opened the ledger she had brought. For the past month, I have been making myself useful. I have been managing the household accounts of Blackmore Hall. Zia Vane shifted in his chair. Your Grace. With all due respect, I am not sure this is the time for a discussion of household finances. On the contrary, Mr. Vane, Dorothea said, her eyes locking with his. Because a house, like a family, must be built on a sound foundation. And the foundation of this house, I have discovered, is rotten. She laid out the fraud, calmly and methodically. She explained about the false company, Northern Timber and Supply. She showed them the invoices, the corresponding payments. She pointed out Von Asch's countersignature on every single one. The Earl looked confused. The trustees leaned forward, their expressions sharp with interest. Alexander stared at the ledger, then at his friend, his face a canvas of dawning horror. This is an outrage. Vane sputtered his charming facade, cracking. An absurdity. The Duchess is overwrought. She does not understand complex estate matters. Alexander, tell them. This is nonsense. Alexander did not look at him. He looked at Dorothea. He looked at the love and loyalty he had felt for this man. And he looked at the cold, hard numbers in her neat, precise hand. And he saw the truth. Is it nonsense? Crispin Alexander asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Is it nonsense that my Suna's inheritance has been dwindling while yours has clearly grown? Is it nonsense that the friend I trusted with my life has been robbing me since the day my wife died? Vane stood up, his face pale. I will not be subjected to these hysterical, baseless accusations. But the most interesting thing I found, Dorothea continued, her voice cutting through his protestations, was not the money you stole. Mr. Vane, it was the money you spent, a single payment 3 years ago, to a London solicitor, for the drawing up of a codicil to the late Duchess's will, a codicil you never filed. A codicil you told no one about. The Earl went rigid. A codicil. What codicil? I believe, Dorothea said, looking directly at the Earl. Was a codicil written by a woman who knew her father's greed. A woman who feared that if anything were to happen to her, her father would try to take her son. A codicil, perhaps, that explicitly states that in the event of her death, guardianship of her son, Arthur, is to remain solely with her husband, and that any attempt by you, Lord Ellsworth, to contest it would result in your disinheritance from her personal fortune. The silence in the library was absolute. The Earl's face had gone from purple to a waxy mottled white. He knew. He had suspected his daughter might do such a thing, and Vane, his secret ally, had reassured him. It was not so. You are a liar, the Earl whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Am I? Dorothea asked. We can send to London for the solicitor's records. I have his name, but I do not think we will need to. As she turned to the trustees, the Earl and Mr. Vane have been working together. Vane encourages the Earl's petition, making it seem viable. The Earl, in return, promises Vane a continued, and perhaps more senior role in managing the Ellsworth fortune once he has control of Arthur. They are not friends. They are co-conspirators. What mote? It was over. Everyone in the room knew it. Vane looked at the Earl with pure hatred. The Earl looked as if he were about to have an apoplexy. The trustees were looking at Dorothea with something approaching awe, but there was one more witness to be heard. A small sound came from the doorway. They all turned. Arthur stood there, in his sailor suit, his wooden bird clutched in his hand. No one knew how long he had been listening. He walked into the room, his small face serious. He walked past the sputtering Earl, past the ruined solicitor, past his astonished father. He walked to Dorothea. He looked up at her, his eyes clear and direct. And then, in a small, clear voice, that no one in that room had heard in 2 years, he said. "A mama." He held up the wooden bird. "A sing," he commanded. And Dorothea, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall, began to hum the simple, steady tune she had invented in a storm. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The Earl of Ellsworth fled back to his own county. A broken and disgraced man, Crispin Vane was facing charges that would undoubtedly see him transported or imprisoned. The trustees, humbled and apologetic, had not only confirmed Alexander's sole guardianship, but had placed the management of the Ellsworth Trust under his direct supervision until Arthur came of age. But all of that was noise, happening somewhere outside the quiet bubble that had descended on Blackmore Hall. That evening, Alexander found Dorothea in the nursery. Arthur was asleep in his bed, the wooden bird resting on the pillow beside him. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. A peaceful quiet. "A mama," Alexander said, his voice soft with wonder. He called you mama. He was telling them who he belonged to," Dorothea said, smoothing the blanket over the sleeping boy. No," Alexander said, stepping closer. He was telling me." He followed her out of the room, down the corridor, to the great hall. The fire was burning low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. They stood before it in silence for a long time. "I was a fool," he said at last, his voice thick with self-loathing, "a blind, grieving fool. He was my friend. I trusted him." "You were grieving," Dorothea corrected gently. Grief is not a folly. It is a shroud. It is difficult to see through." He turned to her, his eyes raw with unshed tears. He would have taken my son. He would have let that man take my son, and he would have finished ruining me, and I would have let him, if not for you." He reached out and took her hand. His was warm and strong, engulfing hers. You saved us, Dorothea. You saved my son. You saved this house. You saved me." His gratitude was a heavy weight. She had to be sure. "Do not say it, if it is only gratitude, Alexander." He looked at her, and the last of the granite, the last of the ice, melted from his eyes. What was left was pure, unguarded, and breathtaking. "When I walked across that assembly hall," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I told myself I was looking for a solution, a sensible, practical woman to solve a problem. It was a lie. I had been watching you for 2 years, telling myself it was because I admired your fortitude. Another lie." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. A jolt, sweet and sharp, went through her. "I was watching you because from the very first moment I saw you, you were the only person in the room who seemed real. Everyone else was a performance. You were the truth. I was a coward, Dorothea. I was drowning in grief, and I was terrified of feeling anything again, so I built walls. And you, with your quiet kindness and your fierce, stubborn heart, you walked right through them as if they were not even there. You opened the windows. You let the light in." He looked into her eyes, and she saw her future there. Not a transaction, not a bargain, but a partnership, a life. "I am not grateful to you, Dorothea," he said, his voice breaking. "I am in love with you." And he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a practiced kiss, not a kiss of seduction. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was clumsy and desperate and true, and it tasted of salt and sorrow and a hope so fierce it stole her breath away. It was the kiss of a man who had been silent for too long, and a woman who had never been heard, finally speaking the same language. Months later, Dorothea stood on the cliffs overlooking the sea. The wind whipped at her dress a vibrant blue, the color of a summer sky, and pulled loose strands of hair from their pins. The air was clean and sharp, and from the gardens below, she could hear the sound of laughter. Arthur's laughter, a sound that was still so new, so precious, it made her heart ache. Blackmore Hall was no longer a fortress of grief, it was a home. The gardens were thriving. The rooms were filled with light and warmth, and the sound of a child's running footsteps. The servants, led by a now devoted Mary, hummed as they worked. Even Poole had been seen to smile, once. The portrait of Eleanor still hung in the long gallery. Arthur would sometimes go and talk to her, telling her about his day, about the new foal in the stables, or about a particularly interesting seashell he had found. Dorothea had encouraged it. They had not erased her, they had made room. Alexander came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist and pulling her close. He was a different man. The weariness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, steady contentment. He smiled more now. He laughed. He had learned how to sing. Badly, but with great enthusiasm. Much to his Sona's delight. "Oh, what are you thinking about?" he asked, his lips against her hair. She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching a ship on the horizon. "I was thinking about a gray dress," she said. "And a woman who thought she was invisible." He turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face, his gaze warm and loving. "I never saw a gray dress." "I," he said softly, "I only ever saw you." She had come to this house as a bargain, a solution to a problem. A duchess in name, a housekeeper in practice. She had been prepared for a life of duty, of quiet, lonely competence. She had not been prepared for this, for love, for belonging, for the simple, profound joy of being truly, completely seen. She was Dorothea, Duchess of Ravenshaw, the woman who had been chosen. She was the woman who stayed.